Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic, we are continuing our look at the 18th century, this time moving away from the economy and looking at life and culture. As always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, life in the 18th century was a culmination of kind of two major events. When I say life, I'm referring to culture, social life. It is the culmination of the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And if you remember going back, things, thanks in large part to the Reformation, began to change regarding family structure. The ideas of the Enlightenment would further those changes. And what we see here is a culmination of those two major social cultural type events. Even though they'll have political and economic implications as well. These are, when it comes to religion and philosophy, it's often a social cultural issue as far as at its heart. Now, prior to 1750, remember, marriage and family changed a lot. Now, in pre-industrial Europe, the nuclear family was the most common. Young married European couples would establish their homes apart from their parents. On average, the age of marriage was higher prior to 1750, especially among the lower classes. And again, there's some reasons for that. Again, this is usually in the late 20s, people are getting married. And they were waiting to get married so they could support themselves, especially for those who worked in, say, proto-industry areas. And for peasant sons, they had to wait until their father's death in order to gain land, i.e. inheritance. And same for peasant daughters, they needed to wait till their families accumulated some wealth to pay a dowry. And of course, some areas still were in the feudal idea of requiring legal permission from a local lord or landowner to endorse a marriage. However, things begin to change as a result of Enlightenment ideals and ultimately the Industrial Revolution. And it's kind of weird to think about, but prior to 1750, there were actually a lot of men and women who never got married. There was no economic reality where you could. In fact, between 40 to 60% of women ages 15 to 44 were unmarried at any given time. As a result of this also, and again, strict moral values, the rate of births out of wedlock were fairly low. Again, this is social controls of villages and families. And families, again, there's no artificial birth control, obviously. And because you were, most of them were farmers and peasants, if a wife and husband lived to age of 45, say, there's about a 50% chance they'll give birth to six or more children. This is, again, necessity. You need work on the farm. This is lack of birth control. Artificial birth control, that is. And it's also that's high infant mortality rates. You got to realize a good stat, this is considered a good stat, 50% survival rate into adulthood. So you are considered lucky with the 50% odds of you will survive into adulthood. Again, just showing how things were. But everything changes post 1750. And a lot of this is a result of the Enlightenment and the result of the kind of first wave industrial revolution, this proto-industry. The cottage industry results in higher rates of people marrying for love rather than purely economic reasons. Remember, this is a long continuation that started with the Reformation. Right? One of the big things with the Reformation and Martin Luther was marriage for love. When again, while those were high ideals that he espoused, the reality was most people could not afford it. there was economic necessity reasons, and of course it takes time for that ideas to filter through to the common people. Well, by 1750, we have not only the culmination of the Reformation, but now the Enlightenment period, and young people are no longer having to wait to become financially independent, as there's new opportunities with this proto-industry, this cottage system. And again, you also see laws and regulations are now being either ignored or overturned as part of the enlightened despot idea. And with the increase of factory workers after 1780, we will see increased young people getting married. Again, it begins to accelerate in 1750. It begins to explode by 1780. But as this increases, we also start seeing an explosion of illegitimate children. Again, between 1750 and 1850, 100 years, there were illegitimacy rates as high as 33%. We think about the idea of premarital sex being a modern problem, and the reality is it's not. Fewer girls were abstaining from premarital sex, and even fewer boys were marrying girls who were pregnant. And therefore, mobility encouraged, again, this is mobility caused by this disruption of the traditional system with the proto-industry, with factories into towns. Again, kind of this first round of industrial revolution here, or early industrial revolution, that's going to continue on into the late 18th century, 19th century. We're going to start seeing greater mobility as people are more free to move around. They are more apt to experiment. They're less apt to settle down if a woman does get pregnant. And the result of this is we start seeing more and more illegitimate births and more children being born out of wedlock. We also start seeing attitudes toward children. This, to me, is a very fascinating topic, is how do you view your children? And the reality is attitudes begin to change during this 18th century. See, poorer women generally breastfed their infants for longer periods than they do currently in the 20th century. Nowadays we're considered, you are an awesome mom if you can get to 1 year. But when you're doing it for 2 or 3 years, again, you're doing it for a couple of reasons. One is economic necessity. You can't afford to buy food. Number 2 reason, though, is infants are more likely to survive on a mother's breast milk than they are by having to feed them regular foods. Again, back in the 18th century, because the foods were not high quality, there were often not time to go around, and your mother's milk is essentially perfect given the nutrients a baby needs at any growth of development. And the result of this was actually lower birth rates because you're having to space children out because you are breastfeeding your child. But when it comes to women of aristocracy, upper and middle class, they actually seldom breastfed their kids. They believed it was crude and common, beneath their dignity. So they actually would hire what are called wet nurses. They actually bring in women from the countryside to feed their babies. And of course, again, wet nursing took 2 to 3 years. However, what this also created, besides increased birth rate, illegitimate births, was also increased infanticide. Now, the early medieval church had denounced infanticide, viewing each life as sacred, even though infanticide was quite common just due to severe poverty. And again, it could be accidental. Again, often because of poor housing conditions or just out of necessity. Babies were often placed in bed with the parents, and therefore a parent may roll over at night and actually suffocate the child. But one of the bigger issues is just economic reasons. And often poor women, for hope that their baby would survive rather than killing the baby, they would actually abandon them at the doors of church steps. And what emerges first in Paris and throughout Europe was known as foundling hospitals. And, you might think of them as orphanages now, but known as foundling hospitals, as again, many poor women are dropping their babies off at doorsteps of churches. In fact, by 1770, 1/3 of all babies born in Paris were immediately abandoned to a foundling home. And 1/3 of that 1/3 came from married couples. Just put a number on this as far as elsewhere besides Paris. In St. Petersburg, Russia, the foundling hospital there cared for 25,000 babies, receiving 5,000 new babies every year. Now, there actually was a number of critics regarding this institution, the idea of a foundling hospital. Now, they're opened up because of a problem. So, foundling hospitals were created to help deal with a very real problem of mothers abandoning their children, or families abandoning their children. I say mothers because it's not always just the mother, but that families are abandoning their children either at doors of churches or just committing infanticide. And rather than having to just allow children to die and babies to die, people like Paris, St. Petersburg, other cities in Europe began to open these foundling hospitals to care for these children. On the other standpoint, critics said that these foundling hospitals actually promoted legalized infanticide, because these foundling hospitals are now being forced to care for them and being forced, these children are being raised without parents, without families. And so while these foundling hospitals were created for a very real need, critics after the fact would say, well, no, but the fact you have these hospitals are encouraging parents to do this and, drop their kids off or kill their kids. Again, it's a chicken or the egg problem, but you also see that we have modern precedent for that. And if you remember U.S. history, things like Planned Parenthood were created to help educate women, provide women resources to not have to either A, have a baby, or not have to, or have a way to, deal with being a parent. Well, of course, now modern day critics then accuse it, of, trying to kill babies. And again, I'm not trying to get in a debate over abortion issues, but just that idea is still prevalent today, from when something was originally created to what it develops into and the critics against it. Now, let's move away from children for men, talk about education. You see, let me go back to the slide real quick. Servant girls had very little real independence, and they were often subject to the whims, physical mistreatment of their mistresses, who often were jealous of these young girls and afraid that their husbands would be, of course, take them as mistresses. And the upper classes would commonly exploit servant girls sexually. And the problem is, if a young girl becomes pregnant as a result of being raped or sexually assaulted, she would be quickly fired by the mistress because, of course, this is an illegitimate child. And of course, now what becomes her alternative? Either A, infanticide, B, give the child up to a foundling hospital. But what is she going to do for the rest of her life now? Because she's now been branded as essentially a harlot. So she ends up turning often to petty thievery and prostitution because she has no ability to get a job now because she's been pregnant as a result of rape. And again, this is often because girls, especially servant girls, are not educated. And we start seeing the beginnings of formal education during the 18th century. Now, we've always had the aristocracy trying to educate children, but we began with these more modern day public school systems. In fact, these were known as little schools, where elementary education began to appear during the late 17th century, where boys and girls from age 7 to 12 were instructed in basic literacy and religion. We start seeing in places like England that Puritans would found charity schools to help educate poor children. France began to establish Christian schools in the late 1680s. However, it was Prussia in 1717 that begins to lead the way with compulsory education. Now, they were actually inspired by the old Protestant idea that every Christian should be literate so they can read the Bible. This was kind of the basis of their ideas. And they saw it as a way, though, to make the population effectively serve the state. So I hate to use the word indoctrinate, but it becomes a way to create nationalism. It becomes a way to create good workers for the state. They're educated, they have ability to read and write and think. And then you throw into that ideas of the Enlightenment, of ideas of critical thinking that will only reinforce this need for education. And so by 1800, as a result of these early schools in the late 1700s, especially though the result of the public education program in Prussia, later Germany, and the result of the Enlightenment ideas filtering through society, by 1800, almost 90% of the Scottish male population can now read. This is compared to 200 years prior in 1600, where only 1 in 6 could read. In France, 2 in 3 can read. In Normandy specifically, 90% were literate compared to only 1 in 6 back in 1600. Now, in Britain, it's not quite as strong. It's only 50% of males, but compared to 25% back in 1600. So again, within 200-year period, we are seeing some drastic number changes. And again, women are also increasingly literate, but still far behind men in general. Now, the other reality is, while I did say you have 50% outcome as far as getting to adulthood is considered lucky, the reality is, though, we start seeing the development of longer lifespans. In fact, the lifespan of the average European increases from 25 to 35 years. Yes, that is pathetic, I know. During the 18th century. Now, there's some reasons for this. Number one was disappearance of the plague. Okay, that's definitely one. Number two, more time is spent by children in education and also in preparation for adult work rather than just work. So the result is they're not having such a hard childhood where they're actually having early death rates. We also are seeing a number of very important medical improvements, though. First of all, improved sanitation. That's a big one. Mass vaccinations. In fact, you see the picture on the bottom screen, that's a vaccination. We start seeing the vaccinations in curing some of these old diseases, old viruses. We start seeing better clothing thanks in part to the proto-industrialization, the cottage industry. And we start seeing a better, adequate, more varied food supply as a result of the agricultural revolution we talked about earlier. So what about the medicine? Now, one of the biggest changes was the work of Edward Jenner. Edward Jenner is the one who's credited with finding this science for the immunology of smallpox vaccine. Remember, what he actually did was he started inoculating patients with cowpox, a cowpox form, that he would give right at the onset of smallpox. And this idea of giving a person a small amount of the virus as a way to build antibodies became the foundation for our modern ideas of vaccines. And it's all, again, credited to Edward Jenner. Then you combine with that ventilation improvements. You combine with that the foundation of the first mental hospitals. Again, mental hospitals prior to the 18th century were just throw you in a cage somewhere and let you rot to death. So when I say the first mental, I mean the first humane mental hospital where we're trying to treat the issues rather than just say you're crazy, you're the devil, we need to, quarantine you essentially. Now, when it comes to religion, we start seeing the development. We talked about John Wesley before and Methodism. This is going to be developed in the 18th century as a way to reinforce pietism. And again, it was the idea that you should have emotional connection to the Christian faith. There's an enthusiasm when you pray, when you worship, when you preach. And you should have enthusiasm for life itself because God's giving this life. This was known as pietism. And it reasserted the idea of the priesthood of all believers, that you should read the Bible for yourself. And the one who really put this on the map and kind of codified this was the man John Wesley. We mentioned him briefly earlier. And he's going to start ultimately the Methodist Church. And first of all, what does he do? Well, he embraces pietism. He embraces that you should have a kind of a radical, fervent enthusiasm for God and for your religious life. He also does reject, however, the Calvinist idea of predestination. He believes that all men and women should earnestly seek salvation, and those who seek it will be saved. And again, ultimately, we see the Methodist Church as it begins to spread out from Germany. What about the arts? We start developing a new type of art, and that's Rococo. And it is largely identified with the court of Louis XV, which we'll talk about more later, who's going to have some big issues, revolution coming. And you start seeing lighter elements with more curves, more with natural patterns, compared to those heavier, awe-inspiring Baroque ideas. These become much more decorative, much more intimate, and a lot less grandiose. So we have these lighter elements, softer curves, softer lines. Again, they're less heavy and dramatic than Baroque. We also start seeing them be less grandiose. Instead, they're more intimate, more decorative. They're more playful, focusing often on scenes of the aristocracy and bourgeois. And you see the one on the left there is Antoine Watteau. He is the first great Rococo painter, known as the Pilgrimage to Cerythia. And of course, one of the most famous paintings, as you see on your far left of your screen, I'm going to move my image so you can see it, is Jean-Honoré Fragonard, who illustrates the swing. And again, you can see it's much more just decorative, it's much more playful, and again, a lot less of that overwhelming emotional idea of we saw with the Baroque art. What about architecture? Well, architecture, likewise, we start talking what's called neoclassical architecture. And we start seeing the Arc de Triomphe, the arch in France. We start seeing Washington, D.C., as known as this kind of empire style. So they're still awe-inspiring, but they don't necessarily have that overwhelming emotional grandeur of the Baroque architecture. When it comes to music, this neoclassical idea of Mozart and Beethoven, the symphony is developed. It's moving away from those dense Baroque textures, and instead we use simple, tuneful melodies. And the other big thing was in literature. Because literature became what we would call nowadays water cooler talk. Again, you would meet at coffee houses and you would discuss the latest great book on the market. And you would discuss it and understand, okay, so what is he talking about? What is the author trying to say? What does this mean for society? And you begin to discuss these things among each other. And again, this is a hallmark of the Enlightenment legacy, discussion of important works. It's also a hallmark, though, of increased education because more people are literate, therefore more people can discuss these things. And it becomes every bit as important as, say, the latest, greatest sport event, right? It's something to discuss and talk about the next day. We also see one of the most important works we talked about during the Enlightenment was on crimes and punishment. Again, discussing these philosophical ideas of whether or not, should we have the death penalty? Should we employ torture? Should it be reserved only for the military, or should it be used in regular court systems? And this becomes the big discussion that everyone begins discussing, not just those in power. Again, these are water cooler topics. And then the other big spectacle that gained traction during the 18th century was Carnival. And again, this idea of revelry, joyous frivolry. And again, Carnival, as it spreads from, places in like Italy and France to places like the colonies, to places like the Caribbean, ultimately into Louisiana. This is or to Brazil. This is a grander celebration that kind of reinforces the idea of the Rococo ideas, right? Because it's all about living it up. It's about enjoyment. It's all about, it's not that overwhelming, religious, awe-inspiring, emotional experience, but rather enjoyment, which again is a focus also of the Enlightenment ideas. We should enjoy our life. It's in the focus of the pietism movement within Christianity with John Wesley, that you should enjoy the life that God has given you. Again, so whether it's overtly religious or whether it's just, secular like Carnival, enjoy your life. And people are able to, because we are seeing a little bit more increase in standard of living. We're seeing more wealth coming in, new jobs opening up. People are living longer lives, not having to work at such a young age. So all these things kind of culminate into a greater celebration of just living life. You know what? Let's end on a high note today. So until next time, take care and bye-bye.